We have no time to talk about 80s, so we will start from the game that is very well known in Poland, the cult classic, the second title in Revolution software history, Beneath a Steel Sky. The game originally was to be named Underworld, but you changed the title. In Lure of the Temptress, during our interview to Pixel, you said the title has been changed, despite the fact that there were no Temptress in the game. So my question is, what was the Steel Sky, and how the idea of Beneath a Steel Sky came to life?
The whole game. First of all, thank you for listening in English. I'm really sorry that my Polish is not particularly good. Well, in fact, it's non-existent, if I'm totally honest. But yeah, the names are really, really important. And when you start a project, you always start with a code name. And as you say, with our first game, Lure of the Temptress, the game was originally called Vengeance as a working title, which was a terrible, terrible name, but it was never intended to be used. And then I was asked by our publisher, Microsoft, to come up with a list of names. And Lure of the Temptress was a joke. And as Peter says, they really loved it, but unfortunately there was no luring and there was no temptress. So we had to change the whole game and story to fit the title. But that actually suited us very well by chance, because Microsoft was owned by a publishing tycoon called Robert Maxwell, who died, and the whole of Microsoft collapsed before they published the game. Now, had we not changed the title, then it would have been published and we would have been caught up in all of those problems. So we then went to Virgin, and that's when Beneath the Steel Sky was written. And really, we worked with a comic book artist called Dave Gibbons, who was the artist behind Watchmen, which many of you will know. And really, we were brainstorming what the game could be called. And he really didn't like Beneath the Steel Sky. And again, we've got a list of all the names. We had Stranger in a Strange Land, and Beneath the Steel Sky kind of doesn't make much sense either, because there isn't really a steel sky. And I guess Broken Sword doesn't have a broken sword. So we've never been very good at coming up with names that fit the game. But hopefully they feel dramatic enough and they reflect the sense of the game. So beyond just coming up with a name that felt right, there's no great reason, I'm afraid.
When creating the ultimate shape of the story, you were reportedly fighting with Dave Cummings, the guy who wrote the dialogues. And the core of this conflict was the fact that you wanted to do something between Sierra Games and LucasArts Games. So something between slapstick comedy and something deadly serious, like Sierra always did. So it was your idea for the Beneath a Steel Sky?
Yeah, Dave Cummins was a very complex character. He's super smart, a really good writer. And I first met him when I went to work for Activision, and I was the head of development, and he was the tester. And when he wrote his test reports, he wrote them in such wonderful English, much better than the games. And in one particular case, there was an adventure game that he wrote his test reports so much better than the original author. And Dave and I got on very well. And then Dave left the company after the second Broken Sword, when we were writing a game called In Cold Blood. Dave chose to leave. He came to me and he said, I want to write adventures. So the stories about him and I not getting on are actually retrospective. We got on very well during that time. It was only later, when he left the company, that these stories emerged. So during Beneath the Steel Sky, Revolution was founded on certain principles. The first one was that our games were not going to be like Sierra, because Sierra took themselves much too seriously. And we wanted to create a humour that then juxtaposed against the serious story. And that was, of course, Lure of the Temptress, then Beneath the Steel Sky, then Broken Sword. So Dave and I were utterly in unity in this. It's only much later that stories about the fact that we didn't get on came out, and that was well after Broken Sword 2.
Tell us more about the idea of virtual theater. It was used primarily in Lure of the Temptress, the famous blacksmith that went from his workshop to the other building. I was astonished a little bit when I found out that this idea was also used in Beneath the Steel Sky. How it worked in the game, in this particular game?
Great. Well, the idea of virtual theatre is that characters walk around and live their own lives. Now, this is way before RPGs, but it's the idea that they have interesting things to say, that they have internal motivations, and that the player can subvert the world to then cause those virtual theatre characters to act in a different way, and in doing so, solve the puzzles. And so the example from our first game, which was Lure of the Temptress, was you had a helper character called Rat Pouch. You had a helper character called Rat Pouch, and you could string commands together. Tell Rat Pouch, and then it would come up with 2 because it knew that you were telling him to do something, and then a list of verbs, go to, pick up, whatever, and you could string the commands together. And within the world, characters would walk around. And I remember so well when we did our first press conference for Lure of the Temptress, and people were really excited. We then didn't really find gameplay that worked enormously well. And so in Beneath the Steel Sky, we had a character called Lamb, who's a Yorkshireman who's very proud of the fact that his beaver coat, fur coat, were the last beavers in the world. He effectively made them extinct. And he would walk around. And then for Broken Sword, we didn't really use the whole idea of virtual theatre, which I've really regretted. So I haven't said this before, but virtual theatre is something that we really want to bring back because it creates a sense of a dynamic world. And I do feel that certainly with Broken Swords 1 and Broken Sword 2, we very much went towards a much more standard adventure format. And to create a more dynamic world, we are looking into how virtual theatre can be resurrected so that it feels really, so our games feel very dynamic. They move away from just the idea that you're in a world and the world responds directly to your input. What we're exploring is ways that the world is more dynamic and you affect the world, and the virtual theatre characters respond to that in an interesting way.
Let's talk about Broken Sword. I read your visit in Paris and reading the book Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, which when we were talking yesterday, you named a very bad book. Were the main inspirations for this game, and why Paris?
Okay, well, first of all, why Paris? When I was young, when I was very young actually, my mother took me to Paris, and this might even have been in the late 60s, or it would have been about 68, 69, 1970. And back in those days, I mean, I don't need to say, because obviously Poland was behind the Iron Curtain, and England was very poor, and Paris was very rich. They were much richer than us. So to go to Paris was extraordinary. The food was amazing. People smoked different cigarettes. People wore different clothes. They walked in a much more confident way. And, you know, palaces like Versailles were just extraordinary. And so I think in many ways, Broken Sword is going back to the Paris that I remembered from those days. And so my family, my wife and I have been to go to Paris many times. But what was special at that time was it was so different to anywhere else. And the idea of Broken Sword actually came when my wife Noreen and I were with our publisher, Virgin, Sean Brennan. and he'd just read a book called Foucault's Pendulum by Umberto Eco, and he mentioned the Knights Templar as a great anti-hero. And in those days, nobody really knew about the Knights Templar unless they'd read The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. And The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail was a book by 3 English investigators, Michael Bainey, Henry Lee. And it is utter and complete nonsense. It's the idea of the Priory of Sion, which is the most wonderful fraud, but fraud it is. And according to The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, the current Grand Master is a fellow called Pierre Plantard, who follows in the footsteps of Leonardo da Vinci and Victor Hugo and Sir Isaac Newton. I mean, you kind of couldn't make it up, except that Pierre Plantard did. And certainly the Da Vinci Code, which came 5-6 years after the first Broken Sword, and uses a lot of the same ideas. And our fans, many of our fans are convinced that Dan Brown must have played Broken Sword and based the Da Vinci Code on Broken Sword. But he absolutely fell for the idea that the Priory of Sion actually exists. And many people think that it does, but it doesn't. It's nonsense. And it's a shame, really, because there's so much wonderful, wonderful history from that medieval period to do with the Cathars, as we talked about, to do with Montségur, Montoya, all of these amazing historical legends that come through and have some basis of fact. It's a shame, really, that the water was muddied by Dan Brown by his claims that the Priory of Sion was actually a factual organisation, when actually it's just a hoax perpetrated by Pierre Plantard.
Is it true that you and Dave Cummings, when preparing to write the script for Broken Sword, were attended to the film writing course in some film school?
That's the film writing course. It's called by Robert McKee, and it's a course called Story, and it's a really, really good, and the answer is absolutely yes. And what Robert McKee does is he's a film script writer, and so he understands the way that film scripts from a linear perspective work. And it was really good to be able to get a sense, not so much of how a film might work, but just to stimulate ideas. And yes, we went to that course, and it was hugely valuable, and definitely influenced the way that we approached the story.
The budget of Broken Sword was approximately £1 million. Comparing it with the budget of Beneath a Steel Sky, about £40,000, it was huge production. And you were collaborating with Virgin Interactive at the time. It was their money and tell us what's the difference between such two standards of work in a relatively small budget and a huge budget.
Well, there were two things happening. Of course, computers were becoming more powerful, so the resolution and the storage was increasing. So let me go back to Beneath the Steel Sky, which was written primarily for ST and Amiga. And if any of you played the original Amiga version and you had 15 discs, then I'm really, really sorry, because it was a real nightmare to play, because every time you were swapping discs. But the reason for that was that it was one of the very early games to have voice recording. And Virgin, who was our publisher, who we had a very, very good relationship with, had suggested that we might do a voice recording. And so there was a friend of my sister's who was in the Royal Shakespeare Company. He was an actor, and he said, I can organise some actors. I'll organise the actors, it'll be fine, and I'll organise the studio. So the day came, and we went to the studio, and it was his friend's house in a place called Balham in London. And the bus went past every 5 or 6 minutes, and every time the bus went past, everything would vibrate. So we sat and started doing the recording, and people put silly voices on. And then at lunchtime, he said to the rest of the actors, he said, "Right, who's coming to the pub?" I said, "Are you sure you'll be going to the pub?" "Oh yeah, we'll have a few pints, we'll be fine." So they went for a few pints, and then they came back, and he said, "Just give us 5 minutes, we're going upstairs for a little smoke." So I looked at him, I said, "Are you sure?" He went, "Oh, yeah, you'll be absolutely fine." So these people came back from the pub, went and had a little smoke, and sounded nothing like they had done in the morning. It was absolutely awful. So we produced probably the worst voice recording that you could ever imagine from these actors who were just having fun. And we had to re-record the whole thing. But basically, it meant that they went on to 15 floppy disks. And then the CD32 had just come out. Does anybody remember the CD32? The Amiga with a floppy drive. And so we could put the voices onto that. But the problem with that is that it only ran at single speed. Later, you could go up to double speed and quadruple speed and 8 times the speed. But it meant that it was actually very slow to get the data off. But that was the idea, and probably it cost more than £40,000 when we included the voice recording. I think the voice recording was only in English. And because of the success of Lyra the Temptress and Beneath the Steel Sky, our publisher, Virgin, really wanted to compete with LucasArts. And their budgets were so much higher than ours in Europe, which is why they said, we want a really, really ambitious game. And so part of the cost was working with cartoon animators. I had read in Edge that a college called Ballyfermot in Dublin was producing very, very high quality animation students. And I went over there and was met and shown round by a layout artist who had worked for the Don Bluth Studios previously, called Owen Cahill. And Owen, I showed him some of the layouts that we were planning to use, and he just roared with laughter, and he said, "These are terrible. These are really terrible." He said, "You need to employ me." And he showed me some of his layouts, and they were absolutely beautiful. And so we did employ him, and he was one of certainly the inspirations behind Broken Sword, because instead of saying, one of the questions he asked is, why are all the layouts just squares within squares or rectangles within rectangles? Why don't you change the angle? And we had no good answer. I mean, if you look at Beneath the Steel Sky, everything really is a rectangle within a rectangle, and you walk in and the background is flat and everything is then drawn within that. And what Owen did is he would draw the layouts from much more interesting angles. And then for Broken Sword 2, he said, well, why are they always at the same angle? And I said, well, of course they're always at the same angle, drawn at the same angle, because the sprites are always at the same angle. He went, let's experiment. And he started drawing at different angles. And we found, to our absolute amazement, that he was right, because he almost always was right, and that actually we could vary the angle quite considerably, and the eye didn't pick up the difference in the detail. So this level of ambition allowed us to work with very talented layout artists, with a company called Red Rover, who were creating animations for Disney at the time, and they did the animation for the beginning of Broken Sword and some of the other scenes. And then also to work with a composer called Barrington Phelan, who wrote and still writes the music for a British television series called Inspector Morse. So it was really the opportunity to grab together the best people, the dream team that we could, and I guess that's why it cost £1 million.
I recently have interviewed the guy from Access Software, and he told me that when preparing Under a Killing Moon, they were meant to produce this game on 40 diskettes, and then CD-ROM have come. So Broken Sword was from the start prepared to be CD-ROM game. And what were the sales of this game? It was an instant success?
Oh, it was a huge success. The extraordinary thing, of course, is back in those days, Broken Sword 1 was 1996. Everything had to go through retail. So obviously there was no digital distribution. So everything went through retail. And the publishers controlled the route into retail, and the developers wrote games. So we had no direct relationship either with retail or with gamers. But Virgin were a very, very successful publisher, and they controlled the route in. And they saw Broken Sword as successful, and the retailers saw it as successful. But it was almost very, very different, because when the game was about to launch, Virgin were very excited. They got behind it. They did a lot of marketing. They convinced the retail. And they did a deal with a UK magazine called PC Zone. And PC Zone were given the game a month before it was ready to release. And they wrote a review. And the review was included complaints about all the bugs that existed. So our first review that came out was a really bad one. And we were really upset, of course, because this was meant to be a deal between Virgin and PC Zone. And PC Zone were not in any way apologetic. They said, we reviewed it. And so that really knocked our confidence, and it also knocked the confidence of Virgin. But because they had it a month early, there was a whole month before any further press came. And then the next tranche of reviews came through, and that was averaging 90, 92, 93, 94%. So in total contrast, so it was at that point we realized that actually the game was very successful. But certainly for a month, there was a real risk that both retail and Virgin were going to lose all their confidence, and then the game wouldn't have been successful at all.
So the last question, and then the questions from audience. Since Beneath a Steel Sky, except for a short period that you made two commercial titles in Cold Blood and Gold and Glory, and apart of this, there were only Broken Sword titles. And now you are working with Dave Gibbons again on the completely new title. Tell us about the project as much as you can.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's really difficult to say, but yeah, we're working with Dave. Dave is a fantastically talented artist, but he also gets involved in the story. Can I ask a slightly different question? To do with Beneath the Steel Sky. Who's played Beneath the Steel Sky? Oh, fantastic. So that's lots of you. Excellent. So Dave used to come, we had our offices in the city of Hull, which is a big city in England, which was bombed very badly during the war. And so a lot of the buildings were built after the war. And it's a fantastic city, but it's not nearly as well known as York, which is where we are now. And Dave used to get the train up to Hull, which everyone used to laugh about, because it was on a main line, and then this terrible little train would bring him across. And we were above a video arcade, but it wasn't even a video arcade. It was a fruit machine, the slot machines where you pull. And the highlight was that at the end there was a little counter that would sell really greasy bacon sandwiches. And we call them butties, bacon butties. But they were really greasy bacon sandwiches. And he would arrive, and the first thing I would do to make up for the fact he travelled all this way is go and buy him a bacon butty. But he would be kind of involved peripherally with the gameplay, because clearly, as a very talented comic book artist, he would never think that he should get involved with the gameplay directly, but he would get involved with the narrative and the narrative behind the gameplay. And this is where I have to admit that I've forgotten what the question was, but I'll go on anyway. And so it was a real pleasure working with him. And there was a point I remember where we were about halfway through, and we were trying to work out what happened at the end. Now, if any of you develop stories, please work out the beginning and the end first, and not the middle. It's always tempting to do the middle, but the trouble is that if you then come up with a great ending, it affects everything in the middle, and in fact, it affects the beginning. So really, you should come up with the ending first. And we hadn't got our ending quite right. And we were talking about, that whoever it was, and somebody was walking past. I think it might have been Adam Tween, actually, who was our animator. And he said, it's his dad. And we went, oh, yeah. And then suddenly, like a row of dominoes, everything fell into place. We went, God, it is his dad. And that's why he was collected by their helicopter at the beginning, and all of these things. So yes, working with Dave was a great pleasure, and it's really nice to be able to do it again. Don't ever tell me a secret, because I can't keep it. But I really do need to keep a secret in regards for this, because for so many reasons we need to talk about it when the time is right. But yes, we are in the middle of a project with Dave, and it's going really well, and it's a real pleasure to be working with him again.
Okay, so maybe it's the time we have 5 minutes for the questions from audience.
Oh, we must have something. We must have a question. God, look. You see, we've got all these people who are saying, yes, I want to ask a question. They haven't put their hand up. I think, Peter, you're going to have to ask another question.
Okay, what have you played recently? Tell us about your fascinations.
Okay. Again, let me answer that in two ways. The game that I finished most recently was Inside, which was, of course, the sequel to Limbo. And I actually finished it twice, which for me, I mean, normally I'll play a game for a couple of hours and then get bored. But Inside, I didn't take that much. I probably took 4 hours. But I played it, and the reason that I was so fascinated by it is that it tells the story. For those of you, has anybody played it? Actually, very few of you. It's a brilliant game in that, first of all, the gameplay is all physics-based. But what it does is it tells a really quite complex story without any text or voiceover. So it's telling the story purely from the gameplay, which I think is intellectually a really, really interesting thing to be able to do. And in many ways, it goes back to the games out there. I have to say I love Pixel Heaven, and I've loved playing some of those early games. And of course, you know, you play the early games, and again, they tell a story they tell it purely through the gameplay. You know, even if you go back to Space Invaders, we don't know why the Space Invaders have attacked. We don't know why you're sitting behind and they're doing all this. So in many ways, it's a kind of a full circle. In that we're going back to games that tell stories, tell interesting stories, different types of stories, but without actually doing it in the way that you would expect. They do it just through the gameplay.
When we were talking yesterday, we agreed that the main problem is not to find the idea for the game, for the scenario, for the script, but how to find a way how to put this idea into game. What genre to choose? Or adventure game, which is now point and click is obsolete. 3D, which is very very hard to make a good one. It is the main problem for you.
That's a really good question. So. For point and click, because it's such a well-known and it's fairly standard, you can afford to pretty much think about what the story is, and then what the great gameplay and narrative moments are. So, for example, I know it's sort of a little bit strange, for Broken Sword 5, because we did the Kickstarter, and because we came up with the packaging, we had to come up with the packaging very early. That idea of George and Nico hanging onto onto the cable car came very, very early, and we designed the way that could happen backwards. Now, there's two ways. The game that we're working with on Dave at the moment, the game that we're working on with Dave at the moment is looking to really innovate in the genre, but to make sure that it brings the audience who love point-and-click adventures. Because the great thing about point-and-click adventures is that people who play them also play other types of adventures and a very broad range of games. So what we're seeking to do is to write a game that is absolutely, unashamedly an adventure game, but then also innovates in the way that, you know, it was interesting that Heavy Rain innovated. It's interesting the way that, you know, Life is Strange innovates. It's all of these games that innovate, that are very successful, that are, well, Her Story, which you may or may not, but it feels like an adventure. All of these games that absolutely innovate within the genre, but are unashamedly adventure games. In that, the narrative drives the gameplay. But the gameplay needs to come first. So the story needs to support the gameplay, of course. And I think when people get it the other way around, then they produce games that might have great stories, but they don't have compelling gameplay, and then the game won't be successful.
The last short question. Have you ever thought about putting new Broken Sword into VR?
We have, yes, because one of the interesting things about VR, in my opinion, is that the big problem is the control of the protagonist. Because you can obviously look around the environment, and that's amazing. But then when you start moving, and particularly when you start turning, and you've turned, but it isn't through head, everybody feels nauseous. And when I say everybody, the majority of people feel nauseous. And most developers are kind of ignoring this. They're still producing games that make the audience feel nauseous, which is very limiting to the way. And what Broken Sword, or what point-and-click adventures do, of course, is they take a third-person view, and you control your character. And yes, that is a very interesting way to tell a story in VR. And ultimately, I think it'll probably have a bigger appeal than going into a first-person view because of this problem of nausea, which is so prevalent across adventure games.
Okay, Charles, thank you very much for our talk. Podziękujmy Charlesowi.
Thank you for listening.